Good afternoon, Southminster scholars. The year is 1891. The setting is London. The defendant is Oscar Wilde. Yes, the author whose name you know. The Irish poet, playwright. Works include The Importance of Being Earnest, Dorian Gray, The Nightingale and the Rose. In 1891, he was 38 years old and the most popular playwright in London. Some of his quotes are still in circulation. You have heard them. Be yourself, everyone else is taken. I can resist anything except temptation. We are all in the gutter, except some of us are looking at stars. And one more I like. To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people merely exist. Well, what got him into trouble was not so much that he was a homosexual. The Victorian age was tolerant of sexual preferences and illicit affairs as long as it was discreetly and properly concealed from polite society. But Wilde was openly gay, and he chased after men half his age. But even then, not too much was said. But what went too far was a relationship that he formed with a 22-year-old poet who was of the aristocracy, Lord Alfred Douglas. Now, Alfred's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, was an arrogant, ill-tempered, eccentric Scottish nobleman. And by the way, from him, we got the Queensberry rules for amateur boxing. He demanded his son Alfred stop seeing Wilde and threatened to disinherit and disown him if he didn't. When that didn't work, he threatened restaurant and hotel managers with beatings and loss of business if they allowed his son and Wilde to be together in their premises. He even threatened Wilde with a beating by a prize fighter. The father then began politically and openly, publicly, accusing Wilde of being a sodomite. Worried that Queensberry might have enough clout and power to destroy him publicly, Wilde charged Queensberry with criminal intent and filed suit. And now the matter did become front page news and the talk of London. I'll let Professor Lindus lead us through what happened next, but in it, watch for Wilde's foolishly misleading his lawyer that Queensberry's charges were absolutely false and groundless. Watch for Wilde's friends urging him to drop the suit and just go to France and write there. Watch for Wilde's refusing this sound advice, and thus the trial began in 1895. Watch for Wilde's flippant attitude, getting him into immediate hot water. Always the artist, he could not resist reaching for creative, witty answers, even when they contradicted earlier ones. Watch for the tables being turned, and Wilde himself now being tried for gross indecency. Watch for the first trial ending with a hung jury, but then watch for the Crown's decision to retry the case and a possible interesting reason for pursuing it again. Here the prosecutor would drop the weakest witnesses and focus only on the strongest. Watch for the closing arguments, which were impassioned on both sides. Watch for Wilde's being found guilty, not so much for consensual homosexuality with his peers, but with young boys. Finally, watch for the impact and the negative consequence of this verdict, not just on Wilde, but on homosexual relationships for the next 70 years.
The year is 1891, and Oscar Wilde is at the height of his talents. but he's longing for something more. As Wilde would put it many years later, tired of being on the heights, I deliberately went to the depths in search of a new sensation. In pursuit of this sensation, Wilde spends many evenings chasing after young men half his age. It is a life of excess. As Wilde himself puts it, desire in the end became a malady. Ironically, Wilde's encounters with those young men might never have come to light were it not for another deeper and certainly more respectable relationship. A relationship that could be traced to a summer tea party in 1891. At the party, Wilde meets a promising young poet, an Oxford student named Lord Alfred Douglas. Though Wilde is 16 years older, the two hit it off and become extremely close. Lord Douglas takes great pleasure in Wilde's attention. Douglas calls Wilde the most chivalrous friend in the world. Wilde sees in Douglas not only a lively intellect, but a young man with an Adonis-like appearance. He simply can't get enough of Douglas. As Douglas later describes the relationship, he was continually asking me to lunch and to dine with him and sending me letters, notes, and telegrams. Wilde also showers Douglas with presents and writes a sonnet for him. They stay together in each other's houses and in hotels, and they go on trips together. Wilde is a great writer, should know that it is time for the plot to thicken. Events and ego will bring Wilde to Old Bailey, the main courthouse in London. Old Bailey will be the scene of a set of 3 trials that captivate England and much of the literary world. The trials will have everything a trial watcher could ask for: celebrity, sex, witty dialogue, political intrigue, surprising twists, and important issues of art and morality. Before we get to those trials, though, let's develop a bit of background. Wilde's close relationship with Douglas first caused him problems when Douglas gave an old suit to a down-and-out friend named Alfred Wood. Wood discovered in the pocket of the suit letters written by Wilde to Douglas, letters that could be fairly described as love letters. Wood extorted £35 from Wilde in return for most of the compromising letters. Wilde's bigger problem, however, was not the blackmailers, but the father of Alfred Douglas, John Douglas, the Marquis of Queensberry. Queensberry was an arrogant, ill-tempered, eccentric, and perhaps even mentally unbalanced Scottish nobleman. His major claim to fame came from having developed and promoted the rules for amateur boxing, called the Queensberry Rules. Queensberry was suspicious and concerned about his son's relationship with Wilde. It hadn't always been this way. When his son first introduced him to Wilde at a cafe in 1892, Queensberry found the writer charming. The two men enjoyed a long lunch, topped with cigars and plenty of liquor. But by early 1894, Queensberry became convinced Wilde was a homosexual, that he demanded that his son stop seeing him. Said Queensberry in a letter to his son, "Your intimacy with this man Wilde must either cease or I will disown you and stop all money supplies. I am not going to try and analyze this intimacy, and I make no charge, but to my mind, to pose as a thing is as bad as to be it." Douglas offered a tart reply to his father in a telegram. "What a funny little man you are." Queensberry took increasingly desperate measures to end the relationship. He threatened restaurant and hotel managers with beatings if they allowed Wilde and his son together on their premises. In June 1894, he showed up without warning at Wilde's house in Chelsea. He brought with him a prize fighter. Queensberry and Wilde argued angrily about the relationship. The conversation ended with Wilde ordering Queensberry to leave his house and never come back. In Wilde's witty words, "I do not know what the Queensberry rules are, but the Oscar Wilde rule is to shoot on sight." Following the encounter in Wilde's home, Queensberry's letters to his son, who he had already ceased to support, grew ever more intemperate. "You reptile," he wrote in one letter, "you are no son of mine, and I never thought you were." Douglas answered, If OW was to prosecute you in the criminal courts, you would get 7 years penal servitude for your outrageous libels. February 14th, 1895 was opening night at St. James Theatre in London for Wilde's new play, The Importance of Being Earnest. Wilde learned through the grapevine that Queensberry intended to disrupt the performance and harangue the audience about Wilde's decadent lifestyle. To thwart the plan, Wilde arranged to have the theater surrounded by police. Blocked by officers from entering the theater, a frustrated Queensberry prowled about outside for 3 hours, chattering, it was said. 4 days later, Queensberry paid a visit to the Albemarle Club, a club to which both Wilde and his wife belonged. Queensberry left a card with a porter. "Give this to Oscar Wilde," he told the porter. On the card, Queensberry had written, "To Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." Actually, the card said posing as a sodomite. Queensberry was never much of a speller. Oscar Wilde didn't show up at the club for another 2 weeks, but when he did, the porter handed him the card with Queensberry's offensive message. That night, Wilde scribbled a note to Douglas, asking that he see him. "I don't see anything now but a criminal prosecution," Wilde wrote. "My whole life seems ruined by this man." The next day, Wilde and Douglas visited a solicitor, Travers Humphreys, to discuss the possibility of a prosecution for libel against Queensberry. Humphreys asked Wilde directly whether there was any truth to Queensberry's allegation that he was a sodomite. Wilde said no. Never, ever lie to your lawyer. When Wilde's assurance was made that Queensberry's charge was baseless, Humphreys applied for a warrant for Queensberry's arrest. The police arrested Queensberry, and he was charged with criminal libel. Travers Humphreys asked Edward Clark, a towering figure in the London bar, to prosecute Wilde's case. Before accepting the case, Clark said to Wilde, "I can only accept this brief, Mr. Wilde, if you assure me, on your honor as an English gentleman, that there is not and never has been any foundation for the charges that are made against you." Wilde answered that the charges were absolutely false and groundless. Never ever lie to your lawyer. When the prosecution against Queensberry set in motion, Wilde thought it time for a vacation. He and Douglas headed to the south of France for days of fun and sun before the trial. About a week before the trial was set to open at Old Bailey, Wilde returned to London. He was met there by several close friends, who wisely advised him to drop his libel suit. George Bernard Shaw and Frank Harris, two well-known friends from the literary world, pleaded with Wilde. They suggested that he flee England and continue his writing abroad, perhaps in more tolerant France. But Douglas, who was also present at the luncheon, objected. "You're telling him to run away. Shows you are no friend of Oscar's," Douglas said. And Wilde chimed in, "Yes, it is not friendly of you." Then the writer and his young friend got up and left the restaurant. Their friends remained at the table, probably stunned by Wilde's poor judgment. In 1895, April of 1895, Wilde's first trial, this one with him cheering on the prosecution, began. Old Bailey was buzzing. Queensberry, wearing a blue hunting stock, stood alone, his hat in hand, in front of the dock. Wilde, in a fashionable coat with a flower in his buttonhole, chatted with his attorney. Meanwhile, in another room, a group of young men, gathered by Queensberry to substantiate his charge against Wilde, laughed and smoked cigarettes. Sir Edward Clark delivered the prosecution's opening statement. Clark's address impressed even Queensberry's attorney, Edward Carson, who said, "I never heard anything to equal it in all my life." Clark attempted to take some of the sting out of a key piece of evidence that Queensberry planned to introduce. He read one of Wilde's letters to Douglas that could suggest the existence of a homosexual relationship. Clark admitted that the letter might appear extravagant to those who have the habit of commercial correspondence, but he said it must be remembered that Oscar Wilde is a poet. The letter could be read as the expression of true poetic feeling, with no relation whatever to the hateful and repulsive suggestions that the defense would like to give it. After brief testimony from the porter at the Albemarle Club, Wilde took the stand. He got off to a bad start by lying about his age. Wilde claimed to be 39 when he was actually 41. Under questioning by Clark, Wilde, with easy assurance, described earlier encounters with and harassment by Queensberry. Clark's final question to Wilde: "Is there any truth in any of these accusations?" Wilde answered, "There is no truth whatever in any of them." After lunch, Edward Carson skillfully cross-examined Wilde. The cross-examination proceeded with two main areas of inquiry: one into Wilde's prior writings, and a second into facts relating to Wilde's past relationships. In the literary part of the examination, Carson asked Wilde about two of his works, The Picture of Dorian Gray and Phrases and Philosophies for Use of the Young. Wilde defended both works against Carson's suggestion that they were immoral and touched upon homosexual themes. "There is no such thing as an immoral work," Wilde wrote in Dorian Gray. "Books are well written or badly written." "That expresses your view?" asked Carson. "Might a perverted novel be a good book?" Wilde replied, "I don't know what you mean by a perverted novel." Carson: "I will suggest Dorian Gray as open to the interpretation of being such a novel." Indignant, Wilde answered, "That could only be to brutes and illiterates. The views of Philistines on art are incalculably stupid." Carson next asked about a suggestive letter that Wilde had written to Lord Douglas. "Was it an ordinary letter?" "Certainly not," Wilde replied. "It was a beautiful letter." "Apart from art?" Carson wondered. "I cannot answer questions apart from art," Wilde said. And so it went. Wilde did his best to turn the proceedings into a joke, answering questions flippantly. Always the artist, he couldn't resist reaching for creative, witty answers, even if they contradicted earlier ones. Though immensely interesting reading, the literary part of Carson's cross-examination was far from being the most incriminating. One senses when reading the transcript that Carson enjoyed toying with Wilde. He knew, and Wilde did not, what waited for him next, namely the question of Wilde's prior relationships with young men. When Carson turned to these relationships, Wilde became noticeably uncomfortable. The jury appeared astonished when Carson produced items ranging from fine clothes to silver-mounted walking sticks that Wilde gave as gifts to his young companions. Suspiciously, the recipients of Wilde's generosity were not, in Carson's words, intellectual treats. Rather, the gifts went to newspaper peddlers, valets, and unemployed young men. In some cases, the recipients were barely literate. Wilde tried to explain, "I recognize no social distinctions at all, of any kind. And to me, youth, the mere fact of youth, is so wonderful that I would sooner talk to a young man for half an hour than be, well, cross-examined in court." Soon after that confident response, Carson asked Wilde about a young man, 16 when Wilde knew him, named Walter Granger. "Did you kiss him?" Carson asked. "Oh dear, no," Wilde replied. "He was a peculiarly plain boy." Carson zeroed in on his prey. "Is that the reason you didn't kiss him? That he was plain? Why mention his ugliness? Why did you add that?" Carson demanded to know. Wilde had no good answer to the question. In the afternoon, the prosecution closed its case without calling Alfred Douglas to the stand. The prosecution recognized by then that no testimony from Douglas, no matter how compelling, could save Wilde's case. The defense opened its case. Carson announced in his opening speech in defense of Queensberry that he intended to call to the witness box a procession of young men with whom Wilde had been sexually associated. The atmosphere in the courtroom became tense. Edward Clark understood now that not only was his client's libel case lost, his client was at serious risk of being prosecuted himself. An 1885 act, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, made it a crime for any person to commit an act of gross indecency. Clark and Wilde knew full well that the act had been interpreted to criminalize any form of sexual activity between members of the same sex. Interestingly, the law which made it criminal, the committing of a gross indecency, was widely seen at the time of its passage as progressive legislation. Prior to 1885, sexual assaults on boys over the age of 13 that fell short of rape were not crimes at all. The impetus for the new law, its main purpose was to protect boys from preying adults, not to punish consenting adults. After trial that evening, with the testimony of the young men set to begin the next morning, Edward Clark met with his famous client. "When I saw Mr. Wilde," Clark later recalled, "I told him that it was almost impossible, in view of all the circumstances, to induce a jury to convict. A father who was endeavoring to save his son from what he believed to be an evil companionship." Clark urged Wilde to let him withdraw the prosecution and to consent to a not guilty verdict against Queensberry. And Wilde agreed. The next morning in court, Clark arose to announce that the withdrawal of the libel prosecution was at hand. Queensberry, however, was looking for more than just vindication. He asked his solicitor to send to the Director of Public Prosecutions copies of the statements by the young men they had planned to produce as defense witnesses. And at 3:30 that day, an inspector from Scotland Yard appeared before Magistrate John Bridge to request a warrant for the arrest of Oscar Wilde. The magistrate delayed. He is said to have asked the clerk of court when the train left for Dover. Apparently, he wanted to give Wilde time to make an escape from England on the last boat to the continent. Only at 5 o'clock, 15 minutes after the train's departure, did the magistrate sign the warrant. But no matter, Wilde had fallen into a pathetic state of indecision. Meeting with Douglas and his old friend Robert Ross at the Cadogan Hotel, Wilde wavered back and forth between staying and fleeing. Finally, he looked at his watch and said, "The train is gone. It's too late." Wilde was still paralyzed with indecision when he learned from a journalist who called at the hotel that a warrant had been issued for his arrest. His face turned white. Resigned to his fate, he sat in his chair drinking glass after glass of hock and seltzer until the police arrived. The damage to Wilde's reputation was substantial. When word of his arrest spread, Wilde's name was removed from the ads at St. James Theatre, where the importance of being earnest was still being performed. Now the tables had turned. Wilde was not the prosecutor, he was the defendant. The first criminal trial of Oscar Wilde opened at Old Bailey on April 26, 1895. Joining Wilde as a defendant was Alfred Taylor, whose job it was to procure young men for Wilde. Wilde faced 25 counts of gross indecency and conspiracy to commit gross indecencies. A parade of young male witnesses for the prosecution testified regarding their roles in helping Wilde act out his sexual fantasies. Although Wilde was not prosecuted for sodomy, there was little doubt by the end of his testimony that he could have been. Almost all of the young men expressed shame and remorse over their actions. On the fourth day of trial, Wilde took the stand. The arrogance of the first trial was gone. He answered questions quietly, denying all allegations of indecent behavior. The most memorable moment of the trial came when Wilde responded to a question about the meaning of a phrase in a poem written by Lord Alfred Douglas. Prosecutor Charles Gill asked, "What is the love that dare not speak its name?" To which Wilde offered this eloquent response, and I quote, "The love that dare not speak its name is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art, like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is, in this century, misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name. And on account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder man has intellect, and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it. When Wilde finished his answer, many in the courtroom broke out into loud applause. Others hissed. Edward Clarke followed Wilde's testimony with a powerful summation on behalf of his client. Clarke closed by asking the jury to gratify those thousands of hopes that are hanging on your decision and clear from this fearful imputation one of our most renowned and accomplished men of letters today, and in clearing him, clear society from a stain. Clarke's closing speech left Wilde in tears. He scribbled out a note of thanks and passed it to his counsel. The jury deliberated for over 3 hours before concluding that they could not reach a verdict on most of the charges. The jury acquitted Wilde on charges relating to one of the young male witnesses with whom he was alleged to have engaged in a gross indecency. Wilde was released on bail. A hung jury, unlike an acquittal, gives the prosecution the option of another bite at the apple. Wilde enjoyed 3 weeks of freedom before the start of his second criminal trial. Now, the second criminal trial was different from the first because England's Liberal government decided to go all out to secure a conviction. The government took its aggressive stance when even people such as Queensberry's attorney, Edward Carson, were saying, "Can you not let up on this fellow now?" There has been much speculation about why the government took its hardline position in the Wilde case. Much of the speculation centers on Prime Minister Archibald Primrose, Earl of Rosebery. Rosebery is believed to have had a homosexual affair when he was foreign minister with Francis Douglas, another one of Queensberry's good-looking sons. Francis Douglas died in what was called at the time a hunting accident, but what many suspect was a suicide. Queensberry's rampage against Oscar Wilde began shortly after the death of his son Francis. There could well be a connection. There's plausible evidence, in the form of ambiguous letters, to conclude that Queensberry or others threatened to expose the affair unless the Prime Minister agreed to aggressively prosecute Wilde. In the weeks leading up to Wilde's trial, Rosebery suffered from serious depression and insomnia. He was very rarely seen. After Wilde's conviction in the second criminal trial, the Prime Minister's health suddenly improved, and he was out and about. Wilde's second prosecution was headed by England's top prosecutor, Solicitor Frank Lockwood. Although the trial resembled the first in some ways, the prosecution dropped its weakest witnesses and focused more heavily on its strongest. Prosecutors, like everyone, learn from experience. The evidence that Wilde engaged in sexual acts with young men was compelling. In his closing speech for the defense, Clarke argued that Wilde's brilliant promise had been clouded by false accusations, and his bright reputation nearly quenched in the torrent of prejudice sweeping through the press. Clark urged the jury to acquit Wilde so that he might give, in the maturity of his genius, gifts to our literature. Lockwood, however, had the last word in the trial, and he told the jury that the evidence showed just what sort of man Wilde was. Wilde is a man of culture and literary tastes, and I submit that his associates should have been his equals. Instead, Lockwood said, Wilde chose to have relationships with these illiterate boys you have heard in the witness box. Wilde's fate hung in the balance for over 3 hours. Then the jury delivered its verdict. Wilde was guilty on all counts of gross indecencies, except for the charges relating to one of the young men. When he heard the verdict announced, Wilde swayed slightly in the dock and his face whitened. Some people in the courtroom shouted, "Shame," while others cheered the verdict. Wilde served 2 years in prison. He came out chastened and bankrupt, but not bitter. He told a friend that he had gained much in prison and was ashamed on having led the life unworthy of an artist. In his long prison letter to Douglas, De Profundis, Wilde said, "I became a spendthrift of my genius, and to waste an eternal youth gave me curious joy." After his release from prison, Wilde traveled in Europe. He met up again with Douglas, a reunion Wilde called psychologically inevitable. But their time together in Naples did not go well. Wilde described it as the most bitter experience of a bitter life. 3 years after that bitter experience, on November 30th, 1900, Wilde died in a Paris hotel room from complications of an ear infection he contracted in prison. Wilde wrote of the lessons he learned from his trials in his eloquent words, "All trials are trials for one's life, just as all sentences are sentences of death. And 3 times I have been tried. The first time I left the box to be arrested, the second to be led back to the house of detention, and the third time to pass into prison for 2 years. Society, as we have constituted it, will have no place for me, has none to offer. But nature, whose sweet rains fall on just and unjust alike, will have clefts in the rocks where I may hide, in secret valleys in whose silence I may weep undisturbed. She will hang the night with stars so that I may walk abroad in the darkness without stumbling, and send wind over my footprints so that none may track me to my hurt. She will cleanse me in great waters, and with bitter herbs make me whole." But what about the larger significance of the Wilde trials? Well, historians have observed that the trials caused public attitudes towards homosexuals to become harsher and less tolerant. In the years before the Wilde trials, there was a certain pity or sympathy for those who engaged in same-sex passion. After the trials, the public began to see homosexuals as more of a threat, more as predators. The Wilde trials also caused the public to begin to associate art with homoeroticism, to see effeminacy as a signal for homosexuality. After the Wilde trials, every male-male relationship of any intensity was under a cloud. Every effeminate gesture raised an eyebrow. And the arts and homosexuality became firmly linked in the public mind. People with close same-sex relationships grew more anxious, more concerned about doing anything that might suggest impropriety. And this before and after picture leads to one final observation about this case, something people often overlook. You see, prior to Wilde's trials, prosecutions for consensual homosexuality in England were about as rare as they were in the United States at the end of the 20th century. What offended Victorian society about Wilde's conduct was not so much that it involved sex with other males. What people found offensive was that Wilde had sex with a large number of young male prostitutes. Wilde was not prosecuted because he was the lover of a social equal who happened to be a male. He was prosecuted for his participation in a not very discreet prostitution ring. Had Wilde merely pursued relationships with men of his own age, especially men of his own social class, he never would have found himself in the dock at Old Bailey. As it was, darker decades for gay men followed in England, but social attitudes kept changing, as they always do. And in 1967, some 7 decades after the trials of Oscar Wilde, private consensual acts involving adults were decriminalized in England.
A few takeaways for me from this trial. Rule number 1, never, ever lie to your lawyer. Wilde served 2 years in prison, emerging chastened and bankrupt. He would soon die in France of an infection picked up in prison. The trials caused public attitudes to harden in England. What offended Victorian society was not so much that it involved private consensual sex with men, but because it involved sex with young men and even boys. But I'd like to end this trial with the lesson with which I began. Never, ever lie to your lawyer. Bill Claytor, Larry Dagenhart says that's also rule number 2. Had Oscar Wilde heeded this rather obvious common sense maxim, his life would have been much better and we might have had more masterpieces. Well, comments, observations, run me down, put something on QB if you'd like. Next week, the trial of Sheriff Joseph Shipp. Even the law is not above the law. And as always, thanks so much for coming.